So we're here to talk about our white paper. What
Yes.
should we do about unconscious bias?
Yep, it's a very important question.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And I think the first thing is maybe to explain why did we focus on this? What's the
Yeah.
relevance of this topic?
Yeah, so we know that there's a lot more work to do in terms of both diversity and inclusion in workplaces. And we also know that bias is part of the problem and part of the solution. It must be tackling it. However, at the moment, there's been a real focus, a hyper-focus on unconscious bias and reducing unconscious bias and unconscious bias training, which, according to the scientific research we have, might not be the most helpful strategy. So that's the kind of thing that's very helpful to talk about. But I think it might be really helpful if you start by walking through some of the diversity stats that we have. So we say there's much work to be done in terms of diversity, but what does that mean? What are companies looking like?
Yeah. Well, if we focus on the finance and technology industry specifically, we see a real lack of diversity, and in some areas, a decline in the amount of diversity in the technology industry. We have far fewer women than we did 20 years ago. It was something about 25% of the industry was female in the 1990s. It's
And
now
just
down.
verifying, women are 50% of the population.
Just
So that's
a
bit-
reminder
yeah.
that they are 50% of the
So it's a
population.
little weird that they're only 25% of the
Well, they're
industry.
about 14% now.
Oh, okay. Well, that's even worse.
It's quite a significant decline.
Yeah.
And then if we look at finance or public sector businesses, then you're looking at FTSE 100. There are more CEOs called Dave and Steve than there are women or ethnic minorities.
So that's really terrible. So we're talking really tiny percentages of certain people in the most successful companies. Is
Yeah.
what we're looking at.
Yeah.
And has that changed much or improved much over the past 30 years?
Well, as I was saying, I think it's declined actually. I think
Yeah.
there's been companies really putting it higher up on the agenda,
Yeah.
which is a great thing,
Yeah.
and saying we want to get better at this. We see the business benefits of having a diverse team and really taking seriously the research that's come out around this, that diverse teams lead to greater levels of innovation, creativity, resilience, but also, bottom line, profitability.
More money. Yeah.
More money, exactly.
Yeah.
And McKinsey's research sort of has demonstrated that over 10 years. So more diverse teams are higher gender equality, are 22% more likely to outperform peers.
Yeah.
But with ethnic diversity, they're 33% more likely to outperform
that
peers.
sounds great, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty
Yeah.
compelling research and showing that it's good for business and it's also good for society to do this.
Now, when we look at the problems with diversity and inclusion, so we say we don't have that many women in these posts, we don't have that many ethnic minorities in these posts, one of the arguments that's sometimes made is that this might be for some other reason, that maybe they don't want these posts or they're not as good at these posts, but none of the research supports the idea that bias isn't a big part of the problem. So for example, for the past 40 years, psychologists have been running studies where they take CVs that are identical to each other and they just swap out the names. So they change it from John Smith to Jane Smith, or from John Smith to John Adebayo, and they change the ethnicity or the gender of the person who's applying for a post. And the reliable findings are that white people are much more likely to be called back for interview than identically qualified ethnic minorities. And in fact, they can be very specific. They can show that there are different rates for Caribbean names versus African names, that people make that distinction and respond accordingly. So they know which ethnicities they're responding to and how they want to respond to them. And with women, the results are a bit more mixed. People like hiring women, at least to some extent. They don't like paying them very much. They'd rather pay them quite a bit less, and they'd like to hire them to less senior positions if they do hire them. So we do know that even when everything else is equal, bias is contributing to the problem, and that makes things quite a lot worse.
Absolutely, and we see that when we're working with clients, looking at how you can actually de-bias or reduce bias in the recruitment process, and then thinking through how bias is affecting everyday decisions in work, how you might staff your teams, who you're going to be giving the most sort of exciting, opportunistic projects to, who's getting promotions, how those decisions are being made. And so I think bias filters through sort of all stages of that talent pipeline. And part of the work that we do with clients is to help them look at how we can reduce or mitigate the way that bias operates. So how does bias actually hurt employees?
Yeah, so some of the research that we've done actually in Equality Group really underlines that. And of course, there's quite a lot of research, but it shows that employees are aware of the biases that they face, and they're aware of the fact that these biases make their lives harder. So there's something like a third of ethnic minority employees feel that their environment, their work environment, isn't very inclusive or very helpful, and that they feel anxiety or stress, and they're more likely to miss work days because of that. A number of sexual minority employees, for example, aren't out to anyone at work. They don't feel comfortable expressing their true identities at work at all. And when you combine these identities, sometimes you find things that are really quite distressing. So something like 10% of ethnic minority, sexual minority workers have been physically attacked at work, which is, that's completely intolerable and makes any kind of work environment much harder to deal with. So people are aware that the biases are not working for them. So then there's a weird question, which is, if the employees don't like anyone being biased against them, and the employers would make more money if we got rid of the bias, why can't we just get rid of the bias? And that's where the unconscious bias question comes in. And that was a great find in psychology. It's not a new find, it's 1998. It's the year that the implicit association test, the best known unconscious bias test, was made. And that's really old. That's a fully grown test at this point. But it was a wonderful new idea, and it was that even if people aren't aware of their biases or don't want to admit to their biases, they can still be detected and then used to predict other things. And it's been marvelously successful, and there are other bias measures like the go, no-go task and approach and avoidance tasks. But these tasks all do the same thing. They get at the bias that we either won't admit to or can't admit to. The great thing about that is that you can then subsequently use that to predict other stuff. So there have been studies that show that this affects the decisions that we make when it comes to hiring someone. So if you have higher unconscious biases against ethnic minorities, you're less likely to hire one when you see a CV in front of you. If you have higher biases against women, you're less likely to want to pay them very well when they come and they sit down for interview in your office. And these things really do matter, and they are actually quite difficult to get rid of.
Yeah. So if unconscious bias is a big part of the problem and it affects all sorts of business activities and the way people make decisions, why doesn't unconscious bias training fix it? That should just do the job. People taking that magic pill, fixed.
So that does seem like the intuitive answer, that unconscious bias training is, if unconscious bias is the problem, unconscious bias training will fix the problem. But the reality is that unconscious bias training used by itself probably will not help your organization. And in fact, all the research shows that if that's all you do, if you just do unconscious bias training, if you just do diversity training and stop, your business will probably be more biased. You'll probably have less diversity, not more diversity.
Lots of businesses have been doing that.
Lots of businesses have been doing that, yes. And that's a very unfortunate finding. And there are a number of reasons for that. So one reason is that we've really focused a lot on unconscious bias. But unconscious bias doesn't make up all the bias in the world. No one's ever said that or suggested that in scientific circles. We don't even suggest that it makes up most of the bias in the world. Bias is incredibly complicated. Everyone has groups that we recognize bias towards and that we just don't like. Being uncomfortable with the feeling is not the same thing as being unaware of it. So sometimes we're not even ashamed of biases. We see them as factual or as natural or as okay. And sometimes they seem positive. So the belief, for example, that women don't really like working that hard. Women just like having babies and making sandwiches. And they're so beautiful and so kind and lovely. They don't want to be in this hard, fast-paced tech world.
No, definitely not at the top of the organisation. They don't want to be leading
any of that.
people.
No, they want to be pregnant and maternal.
Breastfeeding,
And it doesn't sound like open negativity. Just like the idea that, black people just love to play sports and just love to do physical things. This doesn't sound like open negativity, but it is a kind of bias, and it does affect the people that we're likely to hire and how we treat them once they come into an organization. So bias is really quite complex, and it's not mostly unconscious. And focusing only on the unconscious bias really takes away from our ability to handle all the other kinds of bias, and that's a problem.
And to talk about it openly and to have a conversation, and an ongoing conversation as well. The problem with just doing one-off training really on any topic is it's not actually going to lead to that mindset change or behaviour change, which takes time.
Of course, that is another aspect of it, that if you do the unconscious bias training, you can develop a false sense of security, that your company has now handled the problem, when actually tackling the problem is a much bigger issue, it's a much bigger task. But we don't do that because we've ticked the box and said we've done this bit, And that introduces a certain amount of complacency. Rather than fixing all of the things, you just fix a small part and then think you're done.
Hoping it's
that
fixed the bigger thing.
And it might not. It might not. So there is a very good body of work done by Professors Dobbin and Califf, and they've done a number of studies, one of which was a longitudinal study of about 700 or 800 companies. And they found that if all you do is a mandatory unconscious bias training, your company will be less diverse, not more. That you have to include other strategies, or you are not going to meet the goals you're trying to meet.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's this great work, and I think we've seen that just from clients that we work with, actually putting diversity and inclusion much higher up the agenda, putting proper resource towards it, making sure that they have multiple work streams and strategies across the different areas that they really want to tackle and the opportunities that they want to create across the diversity spectrum. And so moving the conversation and moving the action beyond just doing unconscious bias training. We're not saying don't do unconscious bias training, we are saying don't make it mandatory. Should we quickly touch on that?
Yeah, we should say that. So there are subtle differences, and again, a lot of people do take part in diversity actions without necessarily having the qualifications to know if they're doing the right thing. So some of these differences are very subtle. So voluntary diversity training does have positive effects. Kind of small, but they are there. Mandatory has negative effects, and it's a very subtle shift. But you have to be careful about following the research on these things. I think that's a really important thing you brought up, following the kind of strategies that we know make a difference and that we know make the biggest kind of difference. And thinking you can tackle it in one afternoon with some unconscious bias training, it's not going to do it. But there are strategies that we do know work quite well. Strategies like developing accountability procedures, wherein there are people who aim at a particular goal when it comes to diversity and who are responsible for that and who know that and have to answer for that later on in the game. And it's a bit of a thing to say, but of course there are companies who know this and who have the scientific training and who can help you and can employ those strategies.
Yeah. That's what we do. That's what we do at Quality Group.
Sure. Oh my goodness.
Amazing.
Now that I mention it.
So just talking through some of the things that businesses can be doing that will make a greater impact towards building greater diversity and inclusion in their firms. A couple of things that we highlighted at the roundtable were setting up mentoring programs, looking at reverse mentoring, so having diverse communities, employees be the mentors, sort of elevating them and promoting them to share their knowledge and share their insights with mentees who are more senior than them and maybe haven't had as much exposure to those networks and those communities. Prejudice is really bred by a lack of contact, so the more contact that you can make between different groups, the better. So opening up teams to diverse networks, diverse communities, having events, going out and doing proactive recruitment with them has been shown to be really effective.
It's been shown to be really effective, so that is a good strategy. It's also very good to, at the very beginning, figure out how you'd like your search to go. To start from step one, to not say, for example, we'd like this ideal candidate, but to think this is the kind of candidate we want and have a diverse range of potential candidates that you'd like in it. And I do think we could go through so many strategies and so many that are useful, but I think the biggest part of the take home is really that you can't get a quick fix or a quick pill for anything, that you really have to know what your company's limitations are, have a very clear idea of what aspects of it you'd like to change or improve, and then take specific targeted strategies that change those aspects of it. Generally just hoping you can wipe it out with a couple of hours of unconscious bias training isn't realistic.
And could make things worse.
And could make things worse.
And that's the quality journey that we take clients on, so actually getting to grips with their data. Where are you currently? Where are the gaps? Where are the challenges? And then doing more of the education piece so people actually know, okay, how would we go about starting to make progress on this? Setting clear goals and targets, and then actually supporting people through doing that themselves and equipping them to do that, but really helping people to frame it as a longer term properly resourced process for the business, just like any other strategic priority.
like
Like
any
if you were
other,
going to
yeah.
open a new office or you're
Yeah.
going to launch a new product,
Yeah.
you would not expect to do a half-day training and get
No.
that done.
Half-day training on selling cars. Now you know how to sell cars. Goodbye. I'll
Yeah.
never monitor how many cars you sell.
Electric
I'll
vehicles.
Okay,
obviously,
electric
yeah.
vehicles. I'll never ask you how many you've sold or how well any of the parts of the business are doing. You've been trained. I've lost
Yeah,
interest.
it's gonna happen
It'll
now.
be great.
Guaranteed.
We wouldn't approach any other part of business like that, so we
Exactly.
shouldn't approach diversity like that.
Yeah, yeah. Let's resource it properly and make sure that we're getting results.
Yeah. So if you've just heard, oh no, don't do mandatory diversity training, and you're panicking, well, what should I have done or what should I be doing? Don't worry about that. There are some strategies that are proven by the numbers to help your businesses become more diverse and inclusive. So first of all, you're going to want to measure the things you'd actually like to accomplish. You have to know how well your business is doing in diversity and in inclusion. And if you don't know where you're doing well and where you're doing badly, you won't know where to direct your efforts or where to do things better. And sometimes that could be good. You can find out where you're doing really well, which is always nice, and then you can set specific targets for where you'd like to do better. After you've done that, there's nothing wrong with diversity training if it's voluntary. Just don't make it mandatory. Voluntary diversity training has been shown to have positive effects, especially if you know where you're aiming it and what you'd like to accomplish with it. If you've done that as well, you could also do particular task forces aimed at increasing diversity, and these task forces have to have the power or the ability to impose some accountability on the kind of diversity you'd like to have. So it's a very clear structure where you know what kind of diversity you'd like to increase, you've done some training on it, and you know who's responsible for it and who's accountable if it doesn't happen. And knowing that people are looking generally changes the way we behave around diversity and inclusion.
The third thing is to put together a diversity and inclusion task force that covers a wide range of the functions and seniorities within your business, and make sure that that task force is accountable as well for the goals that they've set and the results that they're getting in the business. And the fourth thing is to do mentoring. Have traditional mentoring programs that are connecting with other diverse networks and communities, but also think about doing reverse mentoring, where you are elevating your diverse employees to the positions of mentors, and the mentees are the senior leaders that might not actually know all the knowledge and all the insights and wisdom that they have to share.